American houses obviously are connected as well. They are. Would you say that all?
I would have thought that all of them were interconnected one way or another.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, Rurik, for example, the founder of the Russian royal house.
Mm-hmm.
He was another.
Right. So it's
you get. I would have thought that almost all of the royal houses of Europe were interconnected in one way or another.
Yeah. Which is interesting. How about the Windsors? Do they wield a special place in all of this, or the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha line? I would reckon.
Well, I mean, yeah, as you say, they're actually Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Now, yes, probably, but I haven't. I mean, certainly they go back to the Stuarts, or at least on the female side,
mm-hmm.
and certainly the Stuarts are Olvungers on both sides. So yes, and of course the Habsburg Lorraines and so on.
Yes, exactly. And again, I want to maybe return a little bit to something we talked about before as well, in regards to the land to the east, Outremer, or Jerusalem, as it were. Why this region is so important, either if we talk about it in the context of the Ulvungar dynasty or what have you. But again, I mean, there's fighting to this day going on. There is upheaval over this region. That there's a claim to this piece of land. Do you know why?
Dear. I mean, one of the biggest problems, as far as I'm concerned, is religion. Once you get religion involved, and you start saying that I have a claim to this, that, and the other because God says so, or because my holy book says so, all normal, natural, logical thinking seems to go out the window.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that once once someone says, well, there is one God, his prophet Muhammad, he's decided what the law is, it's Sharia law, and you can't change it. You have a problem. Once someone says, well, according to Torah, God gave this to the Jews, you have a problem. Once you have, a pope getting up and saying that, Jesus Christ is the only Son of God, etc., etc., you have a problem. If we could only get rid of religion, perhaps we'd be an awful lot further forward, because then perhaps people could start talking to each other logically and sensibly instead of all this religious claptrap.
I would agree, but I think a lot of people wouldn't, and the thing is,
I'm sure you're right.
And the thing is that a lot of people, they find comfort in religion. It's some kind of base in many people's lives, and it's very difficult.
Well,
I mean,
I think it was Karl Marx who said, religion is the opium of the people, and to a large extent he was right. The only trouble is that communism is just as bad.
Yeah, well, there you go. Good point. Very good point. It's always an ideology, or again, you're leaving your individuality and yourself out of the picture almost, and you're handing yourself over to devote your life to an idea or an ideology, and that's when things seem to go very bad.
Well, I don't know whether you ever heard of it, but there was a children's story in English about a scarecrow who had various heads. And when he was just being a scarecrow, he had a head on which didn't think. But when he had to think about something, he took that head off, and he had another head down on the ground, and he put that on, and then it was his thinking head.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me that when people start talking religion, they take their thinking head on and put their scarecrow head on.
Yeah.
And all sort of logic and reason goes out the window. And I really don't understand why, but,
Yeah, it's
just something that happens.
Absolutely. Well, it's an interesting question. I remember an article just a few days ago that even actually described the human brain as being hardwired to have a belief in God, which is pretty interesting. That it's actually on some level.
Well, then I'm afraid that my brain has been de-hardwired.
There you go. Well, exactly. And I think it's more maybe prone to an idea of a spiritual life as well. I mean, one shouldn't, I believe, confuse spirituality with religion. Those two things are differently. So, but yeah. Maybe we can talk a little bit more then about. And I know that you must be tired of this, but the Da Vinci Code, I'm tired of it too. And in one way, I hate to kind of return to it. But again, many people have consumed this information as it is now. It's in the psyche of both patricians and people. What's your take on it? Is it true? Is it false? Is there some kind of truth elements within the story?
It's fiction.
It's fiction.
Very simple. It's fiction.
Yeah.
It is based, imitated of what Dan Brown may have said, it's based upon a book by Michael Bagent et al. Called Holy Blood and Holy Grail.
Yes.
Now, I know Michael Bagent, and I knew Richard Lee before he died, and I vaguely knew Henry Lincoln.
Mm.
I think that the problem is that they were sold a pig in a poke, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
None of them are academics. They're all basically journalists. Now, therefore, to them, providing that there was some sort of documentary evidence there, they were happy to go along with it because it was a good story.
Okay.
And I mean, I chided Michael with this many a time. The problem is that I actually showed Michael one of the documents I had. And I think he actually says so in one of his books.
Mm-hmm.
But they are not, any of them, able to look at it from an academic point of view and say, okay, where did this document come from? You know, the fact it was deposited in the Bibliothèque Nationale means nothing.
Mm-hmm.
When was it deposited there? 1950. Well, that isn't very old, is it?
That's very late, yeah.
Who deposited it? Some guy called Henri Liboneau. Well, so what?
Mm.
Who's he? You know, what's his academic qualifications? None.
Mm.
You know, where did he get these from? Well, he made them up. So this whole thing, I mean, don't ask me what the point of it was. I've got no idea. I really have. There's the one thing this whole business of this Priory of Sion and all the rest of it, I cannot fathom what the point of it was. Because it's simply a load of nonsense. There must have been something, I think, I mean, I'm not quite sure, but I think there was this guy, Jean Plantard or something he called.
Pierre Plantard.
Who I think was trying to prove that he was related to the Royal House of France.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this was what the whole thing was about. But I really do not know.
Okay. Well, it's an interesting point.
Well, I mean, there's this guy, for example, who calls himself Prince Michael of Albany. Have you heard of him?
Yeah. We talked briefly with Lawrence Gardner about that when he was on. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, you know, it simply isn't true. His documents don't stack up because when he was called before the Lion Court, he refused to turn up.
Mm-hmm.
And because his documents don't stack up, because Lawrence Gardner, again, I'm sorry, Lawrence Gardner is not an academic. No, he's not.
Mm.
And you cannot go along and say, well, I'm this, that, or the other, when you're not. I mean, you can do it. I mean, there's this guy, Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be King of England, but He got beheaded, didn't he?
Okay, yeah, but one doesn't have to be an academic, I guess, to have a bit of the story, if you know what I mean. But you're saying that the documentation for it doesn't hold up. That's what you're saying?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, there's again, as I said when we began talking about this regarding bloodlines and things like that, that there's so many conflicting ideas and theories out there, and again, it's very interesting just listening to what is going on, and that's why also I'm very interested in the roots and the reasons and
well, I mean, the short answer is, if you have a look at all of my books, you will find the sources for every single thing I say.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, for all of the genealogies that I have produced, there are at least 2 separate sources for each bit of it. Okay?
Right.
With those where I've actually said, I'm sorry, there is only this one source, I have been unable to find another one. But I've said that.
Mm.
That is the difference. You start off with documentation, you see what that documentation says, and you build up from there. You don't start with a theory and then trying to make the documentation fit it. It doesn't work that way.
Right. I know what you mean. But yet again, then, even a document, as you alluded to before, when you talked about that this ended up in the late 1950s in Paris, a faked document. How do you, it's very difficult as well.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, you're perfectly right.
Yes.
A document, in order for a document to be validated, if that's the right word, you've got to know what its provenance is. For example, we know, if you take the Abvius manuscript, okay?
Mm-hmm.
It's in the Norris collection in the United States. We know where it came from. We know that it is, if you like, a printed example from 14 whatever it was, of an actual written manuscript which was in the possession of the Habsburg emperors in Vienna.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we know that. We can show the provenance. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So we know that it came. We know when it started because Eusebius mentions it, and he mentions the translation having been made before 250 AD, and so on.
Mm.
So we've got a complete trail of the documentation.
Mm.
Are you with me?
Yes.
So that's what you have to have. The same thing is, for example, you've got some of the earliest parts of the Visigothic genealogy that I put in. They come from the orations of Themestius, from the Vita Sancta Saba, from the Chronicles of Fredegar, from the Annals of Fulda. These are all well-known documents. We know where they are, what their provenance is, and all the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
And they were written at, or more or less at the same time as the events that took place.
See what you mean.
So that is the other thing. That for a document to be, particularly things like genealogies and events happening, you have to have something that was written within 50 years, roughly, of the event happening.
Mm-hmm.
Because after that, memory starts going.
Right.
Unless, of course, on one or two occasions, like, for example, Doodle of St. Quentin, it says, this was given to me by so-and-so and so-and-so, who is, the brother of the king or the brother of the duke or whoever it happens to be. Okay, fine. He's writing down specifically what someone else has told him.
Mm.
But that person knows the answer, but was probably illiterate, so he got someone else to write it down for him.
Mm. Okay.
But, that's fair dues.
Right.
But this is what one must look for all the time.
Absolutely, I totally agree. It's all about sources and, of course, backing those up and to corroborate the sources, obviously, and so forth. But it's a good point you're making, because this just shows how muddy the water seems to be when it comes to this type of research and how you find your